My name is Kandy Crosby-Hastings. This is a research project for U.S. History 530 at Liberty University. The riverbank makes a very good road. The dead trees will show you the way. Left foot peg leg, traveling on, follow the drinking gourd. The river ends between two hills, follow the drinking gourd. There's another river on the other side, follow the drinking gourd. When the big river meets the little river, follow the drinking gourd. For the old man is awaiting to carry you to freedom if you follow the drinking gourd. That is a song that is from the children's book, Follow the Drinking Gourd by Jeanette Winter. History shows us that abolitionists in the United States were influenced by their Christian beliefs. Those individuals that helped slaves escape slavery and enter freedom risked their own lives to do so. From the Quakers to John Brown, abolitionists believed they were doing the work of God. The following presentation will discuss this Christian influence in the abolitionist movement. We will briefly discuss the movement throughout the United States, but we will dwell a bit longer on the abolitionist in my home state of Kansas, especially on the controversial figure of John Brown. According to the article Slavery and Religion and Issues and Controversy in American History by Jeff Forrett, though the institution of slavery had been questioned in prior decades, the abolitionist movement really began to take shape in the 1820s and 30s. David Walker's book appealed to the colored citizens of the world, and William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator newspaper launched this new radical abolitionist movement. Abolitionists based their movement upon the idea that slavery is evil and must be extinguished. The more pro-slavery forces used the Bible to promote their pro-slavery beliefs, the stronger abolitionists became in their biblical defenses. According to the article Moral Choices, two Indiana Quaker communities and the abolitionist movement, the American Anti-Slavery Association formed in 1833 under the premise that slavery was sinful. Andrew Delbanco in the book The Abolitionist Imagination considers the abolitionist belief to be based upon an idealism that identifies a heinous act that needs to be eradicated and acted upon not tomorrow and not next year, but immediately. He points to the idea, though, that this idealism may corrupt and even lead to criminal activity that is committed in the name of justice. Although they were in a minority, there were abolitionists who did believe that violence against the violence of slavery was often necessary, according to Forrett's article, Slave Resistance. For instance, David Walker, who we just mentioned a moment ago, was a supporter of the 1831 Nat Turner Revolt, in which 60 white men, women, and children were killed. Then there were those on the flip side who, while opposing slavery, were not open to immediate freedom for slaves. They preferred gradual emancipation. Even the Quakers, a Christian separatist group who was known for their opposition to slavery, were divided over how exactly slaves should be freed. According to the article A Great and Good People, Midwestern Quakers in the Struggle Against Slavery, Orthodox Quakers did support radical abolition or the immediate freeing of slaves, whereas groups of Reformed Quakers preferred the gradual emancipation. As a whole, though, most Quakers took part in educating free blacks, protesting discriminatory laws, and aiding fugitive slaves in what was called the Underground Railroad. A prominent Quaker abolitionist was Pennsylvanian Thomas Garrett, who militantly assisted slaves on the Underground Railroad, according to Larry Garra in the article William Still in the Underground Railroad. Likewise, another man from the Quaker state, William Still, was the son of slaves who joined the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery in 1847. However, William Still did have a little bit of controversy attached to his name because of his connection with a well-known abolitionist from Kansas, John Brown. Garra writes that Still did know of and withheld records of Brown's planned raid on Harper's Ferry, which we will discuss in a moment. According to Jill Kaufman's timeline of the Underground Railroad formed in conjunction with the building of actual railroads. According to Richard B. Sheridan in Freedom's Crucible, Underground Railroad in Lawrence, Kansas and Douglas County, Kansas, 1854 to 1865, railroad terms were used to assist runaway slaves at risk of punishment because at this time slavery was still legal, and those who were assisting them did run the risk of that punishment. Therefore, secrecy was a must. The routes that were taken by runaway slaves were called lines. The houses used as shelters were called stations or depots. The owners of these homes were called station masters. Those who aided the runaway slaves on their journey were conductors. The slaves themselves were called packages, passengers or freight. The slaves sometimes actually disguised themselves as packages and mailed themselves. Others wore disguises. Most of the slaves on the Underground Railroad were men who traveled on foot by night and hid in wooded areas during the day. In the Underground Railroad in Kansas, some would cross the Missouri River into Kansas by swimming or taking rafts or ferries. In the winter, they may even cross on the ice. However, most crossed by land just south of the Missouri River. There were free state communities in Mound City, Monica, Osawatomie, Lawrence, and Topeka. We will discuss some of these Kansas events and locations here in a moment. According to the book American Abolitionism from 1787 to 1861 by F.G. de Fontaine, the religion of New England became a type of Puritanism for abolition. Nicole Etcheson in Bleeding, Kansas, contested liberty in the Civil War era, writes of a July 4, 1855 holiday speech by Dr. Charles Robinson, who was a physician from Massachusetts that settled in the Kansas Territory. It really shows this Puritan zeal. Dr. Robinson proclaimed, "We must not only see black slavery planted in our midst and against our wishes, but we must become slaves ourselves." This impassioned plea describes the essence of what has come to be known as Bleeding, Kansas. Bleeding, Kansas ran from the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act to the beginning of the Civil War, according to Etcheson. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, of course, gave these states the freedom to choose whether they would enter the Union as a slave state or as a free state. Missouri, the state next to Kansas, was a slave state and pressured Kansas into accepting slave status. However, Kansas was pretty determined, despite these pressures, to remain free. An 1855 New York Times article entitled "Affairs in Kansas, Proceedings from the Free State Convention" reports on the proceedings from these free state conventions. In this meeting, delegates are encouraged to hold unswervingly to the cause of liberty and freedom for all. They are reminded that God has eternal blessings for those who hold to the cause of righteousness and eternal punishment for those who hold to wrongdoing. Kansas, therefore, must hold its ground on the issue of slavery. The hope, by the way, was that Kansas would be a nonviolent illustration for this controversial issue. Many in Kansas did remain free in their work in the Underground Railroad. For instance, John and Mary Ritchie of Topeka owned a trusted anti-slavery home, according to Sheridan. Information at the Ritchie house, which is now a historical site in Topeka, says that the Ritchies arrived in Kansas in 1855 specifically to help Kansas remain a free state. They turned their property into a sanctuary for runaway slaves. John Ritchie's vision, who is pictured here, was for freedom for all, also for temperance and for women's rights. Here I have some photos that my son Taliesin and I took at this historical site. This is the original Ritchie home. Here we see an area that is now a highway, but in 1855 it was a good hiding place for runaway slaves. Here we see a lantern in the window. The lit lantern in the window was often used as a symbol of safety for runaway slaves. And at this table, Ritchie often met with fellow abolitionists, including John Brown. Which right here we see in the Kansas Capitol building in Topeka, Kansas, there is displayed a mural of abolitionist John Brown. Entitled Tragic Prelude by John Stuart Curry, the mural depicts Brown with a gun in one hand and a Bible in the other. This mural is a good illustration of the mindset of this extremely radical abolitionist. John Brown and his sons came to Kansas in 1855 to aid in the formation of the Kansas government in Topeka, according to Etcheson. He arrived too late to accomplish this goal, but he did support Kansas as a free state. In fact, he stood guard at polls during the free state elections, even though he himself never voted. His son, John Brown Jr., was nominated for office, and this elder Brown did take part in an 1856 meeting in Osawatomie that vowed nonconformity toward territorial legislation that would not stand staunchly with Kansas remaining a free state. He is praised in a November 1st, 1856 issue of the Kansas Herald of Freedom as being a defender of Osawatomie. Ironically, according to Etcheson, when Brown, an abolitionist, settled in Kansas, he settled amidst pro-slavery neighbors. Even though he always believed in the cause of violent abolition, even prior to coming to Kansas, he never practiced it. Perhaps these early experiences in Kansas became the final straw that pushed him into his belief that pacifist abolition was just not working. Brown raised money to arm his sons. The Free State movement was not radical enough for this nonconformist. He was influential in helping slaves come from Missouri into freedom in Kansas, according to Sheridan. However, as Etcheson points out, Brown wearied of this peaceful abolition. He believed religious abolition contained seeds of violence through the idea of combating sin, and this is important, in the idea of a vengeful and often bloody God. An attack in Lawrence, Kansas on Free Staters by pro-slavery forces spurred Brown to action. Late on the night of May 24, 1856, a group of abolitionists attacked the home of James Doyle, his wife Mahala, and their 7 children in Pottawatomie, Kansas. James Doyle and 2 of his sons were killed. James Doyle, by the way, was shot and stabbed in the face. The Wilkinson family and William Sherman, a German immigrant, were also attacked. When Sherman's body was found, it was discovered his skull had been split in 2. Ironically, none of the families attacked in the Pottawatomie massacre owned slaves themselves. They were, however, connected to the pro-slavery party. The leader of this radical abolitionist group was described by witnesses as a man wearing soiled clothes and with a straw hat pulled down over his face. The purpose of this Northern Army was to put the fear of God in pro-slavery supporters. An article entitled John Brown's Career in Kansas that appeared in the Daily Dispatch on December 31st of 1859 reports of the still ongoing debates as to whether John Brown was involved in this Pottawatomie massacre. Attendees at the John Brown anti-slavery meeting hailed Brown as a type of Jesus Christ and applauded the murder, according to this article. Charles Robinson, who by the way was governor now, believed that Brown was involved, and Robinson did not justify such violence. As the violence spread in what has come to be known as Bleeding Kansas, Governor Robinson was imprisoned for treason, and the peace of the abolitionist movement was nearly destroyed. Those who were pro-slavery supporters from Missouri continued to fight. In fact, according to the autobiography of Buffalo Bill Cody, who was a famous Kansas scout and showman, his father was murdered by pro-slavery forces from Missouri as his father was on his way to Fort Leavenworth to receive money for hay that he had sold them. This was in June of 1856. Even though his father told them that he supported Kansas as a free state, he was not an abolitionist, and he did let his attackers know this. However, he was a friend of John Brown. John Brown's most famous attack on slavery occurred at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Etcheson writes, on October 16, 1859, Brown and his men moved into a federal armory at Harper's Ferry and took possession. Their plan was to take hostages, barricade railroads, and incite a slave rebellion. Local Virginians, however, acted before Brown's plan could come to fruition. Men encircled him and trapped him in the arsenal. No slaves rebelled. The troops took John Brown and his men to prison. Democrats believed that Brown's actions could be traced back to the rebellion of this free state movement, a claim that was strictly denounced by Northerners as a whole. Even though supporters of Brown mourned his future, Brown was condemned to hang for his crimes. In a letter to his nephew that appeared in the New York Times just prior to his hanging, John Brown wrote this. Notice the biblical references in this. Whether I have any reason to be of good cheer or not, in view of my end, I can assure you that I feel so, and that I am totally blinded if I do not really experience that strengthening and consolation you so faithfully implore in my behalf. God of our Father, reward your fidelity. I feel neither mortified, degraded, nor in the least ashamed of my imprisonment, my chain, or my near prospect of death by hanging. I feel assured that not one hair shall fall from my head without my heavenly Father. I also feel that I have long been endeavoring to hold exactly such a fast as God has chosen. A December 5, 1859 New York Herald article described in full detail John Brown's execution. It talks about the transportation to the execution place, his final words to his wife, and even sermons and lectures that were written after his execution. The article describes meetings by abolitionist societies which, according to the author, committed blasphemy by comparing denial of John Brown and his actions against slavery with the denial of Jesus Christ himself. A sermon by the Reverend Antoinette Brown Blackwell held Brown as a martyr. According to a Daily Dispatch of Richmond, Virginia article entitled John Brown's Favorite Hymn, abolitionists across the country remembered John Brown by singing his favorite hymn, Blow Ye the Trumpet, which the author contends was a symbol for Brown's war against slavery. Lunatic or hero, and there are still those today who debate just exactly what John Brown was. However, However, most of those who worked in the Underground Railroad have gone down in history as defenders of freedom. To close, I would like to read from a May 1909 article about one of the most well-known and well-loved abolitionists of all times. Harriet Tubman was a woman who was responsible for leading 300 slaves, including her own parents, to freedom. While she did this, she risked her own lives because she also was a former slave and, of course, an African-American woman. The article reads, Harriet Tubman has been called the Moses of her people and is known as Aunt Harriet to whites and blacks alike. From many points of view, she is a remarkable woman. Abolitionism, it could be said, holds a remarkable place in America's Christian heritage.